We have all heard of cavemen, our hairy, muscular ancestors that banged rocks together and hunted animals and invented fire, and well, lived in caves. What many people don't know though is that this is more of a blanket term that is not only encompassing Homo sapiens, but is more of a general term for any species at that time that can be classified as a human, all the way from some of the coldest times of the Ice Age, all the way up to possibly around 13,000 years ago. Homo sapiens weren't by any means the only humans running about. In this video, I plan to cover the main ones throughout this large span of time, what they were worse than us at, what they were better than us at, as well as just some general knowledge about them. Knowledge that modern humans have largely forgotten about, despite being within the memory of some of your ancestors. So, in that case, let's jump straight into it. Neanderthals. Largely found throughout Europe and parts of Western and Central Asia, Neanderthals used these areas as a sort of core area and refuge during the harsh climates of the time, with typical movements more north occurring later over time as ice sheets started to melt. This, however, was not always the case, with evidence of Neanderthals sometimes retreating to more southern areas, such as nearer to the Mediterranean, during the colder periods of the last ice age. Neanderthals mainly used the strategy of brute force in order to survive the last ice age, often being great at hunting large animals in a more physical manner than its relative humans at the time. They would hunt anything from a mammoth all the way to various deer and birds. Neanderthals being evolved to be greatly specialized to this style of hunting, having more shorter and stockier builds, with thicker skeletons, heavier bones, and more specialized muscle attachments, allowing for larger and more powerful muscles, as well as just generally more muscle mass. With studies estimating that fully grown male Neanderthals being able to most likely bench press around 200 kilos, or around 500 pounds, and fully grown females being able to most likely bench press around 160 kilos, or around 350 pounds, without any prior training being involved, making them incredibly strong. In addition to the strength, they were highly durable, with up to 80 to 95% of skeletons found having evidence showing healing from extreme trauma. Compared to the more long-distance and patient hunters like Homo sapiens, Neanderthals were more adjusted to short bursts of energy, with increased androgen levels, which made them both more aggressive and great sprinters, with estimates putting their sprinting speed at around 20 to 25 mile an hour, or around 32 to 40 kilometers per hour. As well as this, Neanderthals were greatly adapted for the cold, showing that their stockier and more muscular builds possessed an also great design for retaining heat, with their denser builds providing less surface area to minimize their heat loss. Although this entire build came at a large cost, with a larger caloric intake per day reaching around 3,100 to 6,700 calories per day in some estimates. This being compared to the average modern human need of around 1,600 to 3,000 calories a day can really show the difference in the amount of effort needed to keep these guys sustained. Moving on to their brains and behaviours. Against what popular culture has us to believe, Neanderthals actually had a brain very comparable to modern humans of the time. Evidence of tool creating, such as knives, scrapers, and short spears, such as those found in the Clacton and Leringen dig sites, for example, often made out of bone and sharp rock such as flint, in combination of a natural resin and tar glue in order to secure it. Despite their similar brain capacity and intelligence, there were large differences in their behaviours to that of other human species. Neanderthals focused less on their behaviours in terms of forming more complex social groups like those in Homo sapiens, but rather focus more on spatial awareness and being as adapted to their environment as possible. This, while sounding great for survival, did come at the deficit of only sticking within small groups that, while successful, could fall to issues such as inbreeding. However, evidence does show that Neanderthals still cared for their small groups heavily, showing that they cared for their sick and elderly and even buried their dead, which indicates that they did have empathy and somewhat abstract thought. Often to counteract the issue of inbreeding, Neanderthals did have to interbreed with other human species, with Homo sapiens and Homo erectus, just for example, having around 2% of the DNA of non-African modern humans being that of Neanderthal, with evidence of this actually slightly affecting the humans of today. Evidence of it mainly affecting fertility, pain tolerance, and immune system responses, with cases of vaccines, modern medicine, and a general increase in fertility, mostly in women, being due to the 2% of Neanderthal DNA. The leading factor in the decline of the Neanderthal population was largely due to the changing environmental conditions faced in their territories, with Neanderthals facing extinction around 40,000 to 45,000 years ago, when conditions shifted to a more cold and arid environment. This led to reducing food sources and competition over resources with other human species. Meanwhile, other, more successful human species at the time were mainly out advancing them and diverting their food sources, with a main example such as Homo sapiens being well known at this time for hunting fish and smaller game, which could not sustain the large calorie needs of Neanderthals, leading to their fairly rapid extinction. Denisovans. Predominantly around the more mountainous areas, such as in the Tibetan Plateau, in what would be the modern northwest of China, and the Altai Mountains in Siberia, with the earliest appearances of them being around 300,000 years ago in Siberian caves. They developed around surviving such high altitudes and typically harsh environments. This was enabled through the development of the super athlete gene variant, also known as EPA21, which allowed them to survive in the more low oxygen areas, such as in higher altitude areas. This is due to the gene allowing for a more higher oxygen efficiency, which is actually still present in the modern natives of the region, who are known as the Tibetans and the Sherpas. Due to the general nature of the area, Denisovans were known to hunt a variety of animals, including hyenas, woolly rhinos, and deer, just to name a few. Traces of wooden spears and stone tools can be found around Denisovan settlements, with the usage of wooden spears in order to hunt. However, in such difficult environments, they also scavenge for plants and even bone marrow. Evidence of bone marrow extraction can be found in sites such as the Baishai Karst Cave in China, which shows clear evidence of butchery using stone tools to cut meat and break bones, while also likely using the hides for clothing in the cold altitudes. Denisovans were stout and thick-bodied, even more so than the Neanderthals, likely being similar, if not slightly stronger, than Neanderthals. Slight oddities can be seen in their skeletal remains, however, one of these being a complete lack of wisdom teeth, with the exact cause of this being not fully understood. With Denisovans unfortunately being one of the least understood ancient human species, with estimations in their weight still largely being unknown, with no complete skeleton being discovered thus far. However, based on modern DNA and the small amount of evidence we have, we know that Denisovans likely heavily exploited their ability within the mountainous and steppe environments, with little competition compared to other species that often fought over one another in terms of resources in the more flatland and woodland areas. Although This didn't stop Denisovans from expanding elsewhere. Evidence of Denisovans expanding over towards the more north-south realm, or otherwise modern-day Indonesia and Malaysia, are very evident. In the modern world, large populations of people, such as the Papua New Guinea peoples, have been partly supplemented by the Denisovan DNA, with their small yet apparent Denisovan DNA assisting them in the form of their immune systems, allowing them to survive in these harsh regions in which they have a large amount of new and native diseases, most commonly in the form of polio and dengue in the modern day. Despite their successes, however, Denisovans began to disappear, eventually becoming extinct around 30,000 to 50,000 years ago. A large mixture of their generally small communities and climate change, as well as the typical competition and absorption by Homo sapiens that many other species experienced at this time, caused their main decline, with smaller communities being under threat of inbreeding made it so they were generally more affected and vulnerable to the climate change nearer to the end of the Ice Age, with this climate change also leading to their food sources becoming scarce, especially in mountainous terrains. However, a display of rapid and more dramatic ending of the Denisovans wouldn't have been the case. A more gradual assimilation with the more successful Homo sapiens and the lowering populations over time due to the reducing resources would be more correct, with this linking back to the present DNA of the Denisovans in more modern Asians and Oceanic peoples of today, such as the New Guinea and Tibetan peoples of today. Homo florensiensis, otherwise known as the Flores Man or hobbits. Homo florensiensis were a species of human only found on the island of Flores in modern Indonesia, appearing around 190,000 years ago. Developing from their ancestors, they've been found to arrive on the island around 1 to 1.27 million years ago. Due to their generally small area in which they occupy, little traces have been found, although, from what archaeologists have found from adult specimens, they would have been around 1.06 meters tall, or around 3 foot 6 inches tall when fully grown, and would have weighed around 30 kilos or 66 pounds, with these small populations being discovered speckled within caves around the island. The first of these specimens being an individual that stood at around 3 foot 7 inches tall, or around 1.09 meters tall, that was discovered in 2003 in the Liang Buao cave. Since then, as of 2015, partial skeletons of 15 individuals have been recovered, including one full skull. Despite their small size, they have largely unchanged features from our common ancestor, Australopithecus, having features such as long arms relative to their legs, suggesting they still largely use their previous ancestors' ability to climb extremely well to their advantage. In addition, despite their small sizes again, they still possessed heavily muscled autonomy and thick limb bones with distinct cranial features. This made them largely durable and strong for their size, with their smaller state most likely originating from the phenomenon known as island dwarfism that usually comes from prolonged isolation alongside limited resources and a lack of predators. A more recent example that came from the same island of Flores is a variation of stegodon elephant, also known as pygmy stegodons, or, more well known, pygmy elephants. These being a miniature elephant species that were around roughly from 11 million years ago all the way to as recent as 25,000 to 12,000 years ago. These pygmy elephants, being only 1.2 to 1.9 meters tall, or around 4 to 6 feet, and weighing around 130 to 300 kilos, or around 300 to 600 pounds. In addition to the unique appearance of Homo florensiensis, There has been evidence of many using stone tools, much like the ones broadly found in Africa and Asia. Using these stone tools, Homo floresiensis would have often selectively hunted the pygmy elephants that I mentioned earlier, with evidence of butchery marks on the pygmy stegodon's bones and various fragments of their bones being found within floresiensis settlements. Despite this, the land wasn't just casual miniature elephant hunting for Homo floresiensis, with often their utilization of caves and crafting of their sophisticated stone tools, such as blades and flakes, as well as the usage of fire, wasn't just for hunting, but also for protection. Ancient floras were shared alongside Homo floresiensis as well as Komodo dragons and a species of large rodent known as the Flores giant rat. Because of this, Homo floresiensis populations never grew or spread across as rapidly as they could have, with their isolation to the island of Flores making it so that no modern humans have present Homo floresiensis DNA within them, with the surrounding waters around the island of Flores being largely deep waters, and over thousands of years of isolation led them to an unfortunate dead end. A mixture of factors, mainly that of environmental changes, being the leading idea to the cause of their extinction, with the island of Flores being very vulnerable to severe drought due to the island's limited food sources, as well as the later arrival of Homo sapiens nearing the end of Homo floresiensis's reign on the island, driving up competition. This over some period around 12,000 years ago, unfortunately, led to Homo floresiensis going extinct. Homo erectus, most notably known as the longest lived species of human to have ever lived, living from around 2 million years ago all the way until becoming extinct around 110,000 years ago, with being accredited as the first hominins to leave the continent of Africa. This species of human generally laid the foundation that other species would follow suit, with Homo erectus leaving Africa as early as 2 million years ago, with the remains of Homo erectus being found all over Eurasia, dating as old as 1.8 million years old. In a way, this species were a pioneer, with later species such as Homo sapien only having evidence of leaving Africa around 60,000 to 70,000 years ago, leaving Homo erectus to possibly roam the surrounding lands of Eurasia uncontested from other species of human for possibly hundreds of thousands of years. While often mistaken as the first human species ever, they are one of the first to more resemble modern human anatomy in terms of bodily proportions. With a large amount of rapid initial spread over lands such as Europe and Asia and even Indonesia being mostly accredited to their modern proportions, allowing for efficient walking and running compared to earlier counterparts. With earlier counterparts such as Homo habilis around 400,000 years earlier having a more ape-like body in ratio didn't allow for such advantages. Homo erectus gets more of a reputation, however, than previous species such as Homo habilis for playing a more foundational role for what would later be human species that would follow, all of which that I cover in this video. This breakthrough in modern human design allows them to travel distances to gain resources and track prey down. This in combination with the passing down trait of sweating allowed them to cool down as they moved rather than having to stop and pant or wait like other animals. This was essential to the success of the modern human, as Homo erectus pioneered a strategy of slowly wearing down prey that utilized a more quick and sprinting away sort of strategy, while Homo erectus fully exploited their human endurance to slowly follow these types of prey until they were fully exhausted to be able to get an easy final blow on their target. Homo erectus, like us today, varied in height and weight amongst individuals, with individuals typically ranging around 1.79 to 1.8 meters, or around 5 foot 10 to 5 foot 11, and weighing around 40 to 60 kilos, or around 88 to 132 pounds. In addition to their frame and limbs, the most revolutionary changes from their more ape-like ancestors and relatives is their brain. Homo erectus's brain evolved rapidly over their reign. Over its 2 million-year existence, their brains increased roughly 50% in cranial capacity and had a rapid general growth, with major markings in shifts towards more complex social and cognitive abilities. These developments were key for the success of the human species that would follow, the most notable of these breakthroughs being the Acheulean industry, or otherwise Homo erectus's creation of advanced and diverse stone tools. These most commonly can include hand axes and later spears. A skill in toolmaking being previously inaccessible before improved planning and memory were developed from their increased brain size. Further behaviors from their increased brain size, such as prolonged learning and socializing, allowed for them to pass advanced skills and knowledge, with these further developments over time increasing the general odds of survival for the whole human species, leading to the further needs for development that followed as the species evolved. Over time, Homo erectus's bone structure changed alongside their increased brain sizes. With the ever-increasing need to sustain a growing brain, so did their need for high-protein diets, with smaller teeth and a jaw more suited for meats developing, as well as newly cooked foods with the invention of fire, was vital for gaining high-quality nutrients from carcasses and things that they harvested. While overall a true pioneer of the species, Homo erectus's reign would come to a close roughly around 110,000 years ago, with the rapidly changing environments transforming the open woodlands that they thrived in into a more tropical rainforest. As well as this, Homo erectus was largely being outlasted and outperformed by the newer, more advanced hominin species that were better adapted to the newer and changing environments, with Homo erectus more so being a victim of their own success, with these new species that were outcompeting them all being derived from Homo erectus itself, with Homo erectus giving rise to species such as Neanderthals, Homo sapiens, and even the Denisovans that were all more adapted to their specific environments rather than the more broad build that the Homo erectus pioneered for so long. Homo sapiens. We have finally now arrived at us, Homo sapiens. While in the modern world we appear all over the globe, this wasn't obviously always the case, appearing similarly to our cousins and ancestors in Africa, approximately around 300,000 years ago, with the oldest known Homo sapien remains being a 300,000-year-old skeleton that was discovered at Jebel Irhoud in Morocco. What largely sets Homo sapiens apart from other human species at the time was mostly our more developed brains. Homo sapiens were accredited to having a more abstract and complex way of thinking, with evidence of ancient Homo sapiens forming rituals, making music, forming widespread social networks, and even having personal adornments such as shell beads, necklaces, ivory beads, pendants, and various items of clothing, just to name a few. Homo sapiens' success mostly lies within the social bonds that they formed, with typically larger groups forming in Homo sapiens than other human species at the time. A typical band of Homo sapiens being around 30 to 50 people. However, These were often a part of a wider clan or tribe that would often gather seasonally in order to avoid both inbreeding and also to have time to trade resources and generally socialize. With these larger clans/tribes having an estimated to have reached upwards of around 1,500 to 2,000 individuals. This was wildly different from other species of human at the time, with Neanderthals, for example, averaging around groups of 20 people. However, these groups weren't ever part of some larger clan or tribe, and were instead largely isolationist, with it being believed that Homo sapiens had the capacity of rough language to have appeared around 150,000 to 200,000 years ago, with such early development of a basic language, making it easier to form such larger groups to begin with, as well as advance in social behaviors sooner. Earlier Homo sapiens would have likely used this rough language to exchange goods with their larger clan or tribe. Evidence of materials such as obsidian, flint, and shells for toolmaking being traded in these networks can be found as early as 50,000 years ago, with some of these networks among their wider groups reaching distances of around 100 kilometers or 62 miles away. Evidence for why Homo sapiens' brains developed so rapidly can be attributed to a handful of reasons. A high-energy diet was largely accessible to Homo sapiens, with the widespread usage of fire amongst hominids for cooking foods being evident even before Homo sapiens began to appear. Once Homo sapiens came along, of course they used this alongside fermented foods and then later processed foods to their full advantage, with energy surpluses allowing for genetic changes and brain development to occur at a faster rate. Development of specific genes such as the PPP1R17 gene rapidly sped up neuron growth and development compared to other human species at the time, allowing for greater imagination, invention, and social bonding. Eventually, the Homo sapiens' success couldn't be contained just on the African continent, with major expansions outside Africa beginning around 60,000 to 90,000 years ago. Homo sapiens spread across coastlines all the way from Africa to Asia and Australia by around 50,000 to 65,000 years ago, with expeditions to Australia likely being taken by early watercraft from the subcontinent of Sundaland, or otherwise known as Sunda, in what would be modern-day Indonesia and Malaysia. This was largely possible by the lower sea levels at the time, thereby crossing the shallower Strait of Sea towards the larger continent of Sahul, a large landmass that included Australia, New Zealand, and Tasmania, with evidence of ancient Australians being among some of the world's first ocean voyagers, with the earliest evidence of Homo sapiens being in Australia being the Majebebe rock shelter, which would suggest that they arrived in Sahul as early as 65,000 years ago. Following the sea voyages in Southeast Asia, other groups of Homo sapiens were beginning to arrive in Europe around 45,000 to 54,000 years ago, likely travelling through the Levant into Turkey, whereby they would have encountered established Neanderthal populations before either replacing them or fighting them or integrating them over time. Following this, they would have travelled west, entering in waves through the Balkans and along the Mediterranean coastline, with these arrivals being much later than previous arrivals into the areas such as Asia and Australia, likely suggesting that multiple failed attempts were made in creating more permanent establishments on the European continent, becoming easier later in time as warmer periods from the fleeing Ice Age came around. Lastly, Homo sapiens finally made it to the Americas, with the most popular theory being the Bering Land Bridge. The Bering Land Bridge being a huge landmass that was believed to have been up to around 1,000 kilometers or 620 miles wide at its greatest extent, and covering an area as large as British Columbia and Alberta together, totaling around 1.6 million kilometers squared, around 620 miles squared. This massive stretch of land allowed peoples in Siberia to cross over to areas such as modern Alaska and northern parts of Canada, with the earliest settlements in America being estimated to be around 23,000 to 21,000 years ago, before the British eventual flooding as sea levels began to rise again around 11,000 years ago. Evidence in recent sites backing this claim was sites such as White Sands National Park in New Mexico, implying human presence as early as 21,000 years ago, with evidence of fossilized footprints. In addition to their travels, Homo sapiens brought along their technologies with them, with some of the most famous examples of ancient inventions being fishing technology in the Congo as early as 90,000 years ago, with the invention of harpoons and barbed points, bows and arrows being found as early as 70,000 years ago in areas of southern Africa, and the oldest known cave paintings by Homo sapiens being in the South Sulawesi in Indonesia, with a red hand stencil, dated to be at least 67,800 years ago, often showing sophisticated art and symbolic thinking that was developed with depictions of fingers being modified as claws, showing a usage of self and imagination rather than merely depicting their surroundings. Overall, the history of our genus stretches far more than just Homo sapiens, with our stronger, weaker, older, smaller, and bigger relatives, as well as our species having a whole swath of history and prehistory that is largely forgotten about within the stretch of what being a human is. But with all that, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.